Hi, I'm John Messer, the Regional Executive of the Great Lakes and Leadership Catalyst. Today we're going to start a 5-part series, and it's going to be a series that can be very transformational for church leaders. What if I told you that most church problems really are the result of one factor? What if I told you that if you understand things from a different perspective, most church problems could be resolved fairly easily, and that you wouldn't have to spend most of your time playing whack-a-mole trying to fix all the problems or putting out forest fires. You could spend more of your time doing what you're gifted and trained and called to do. What about that? Well, then I'm going to tell you about systems thinking, because that's exactly what systems thinking is about. You know, most of our problems in church leadership are not that we have enemies or there are people that we have to find and assign blame to. The problem is that churches are a system, and we don't apply systems thinking to the churches, and so we create problems because of how we do what we do. And here's why we create those problems. We are trained, we're raised to think in a linear way. We're trained to break systems down into their smallest parts, and we analyze the smallest part, thinking that the smallest part is representative of an entire system or a whole body. Now, when we think about that, we know perfectly well that we can't really understand a human body if we only look at a kidney. We have to look at the whole, and that's really what systems thinking is about. But let's talk about how we are linear thinkers first, to be able to contrast systems thinking with linear thinking. Linear thinking works like this. We see a problem in the church and we apply a fix. And we think, because we're thinking of smaller parts, that if I apply a fix to this one small part, everything in the system will work the way it's supposed to work because I've fixed that problem. Well, the problem is that's merely applying a symptomatic fix to the symptom of the problem rather than dealing with the real problem. So when we treat symptoms, the quick fixes don't really solve the underlying issue, and so the problem recurs. And that's why we end up playing whack-a-mole. That's why we end up putting out forest fires. And we never have time to do fire prevention. We never have time to do the planning and the leadership that we want to do. Linear thinking is characterized by these attitudes. We break things into their component pieces. We try to fix symptoms, which is putting out forest fires. We're concerned primarily with assigning blame. Find out who's responsible, who made it happen, who was wrong, who did this. Or we're trying to find the culprit. Who's against us? Who doesn't want this to work? Or we're trying to control the chaos. We're trying to bring order out of chaos, which doesn't work. Or we believe that churches are predictable and orderly. The problem is this: when we think in those ways, component pieces, fixing symptoms, assigning blame, controlling chaos to create order, believing that our churches are predictable and orderly, the problem is that's linear thinking. And here's the truth. This has been attributed to Albert Einstein. Don't know if that's actually true, but that's who he's attributed to. And he said, you cannot solve problems with the same thinking that created them. So if linear thinking created our problems in the church, then we can't solve those problems with linear thinking. And that's what we're doing in the church. We're trying to solve linear problems with linear thinking, and it's not working. So let me give you a new way. Let me give you a better way. What if we use systems thinking? Systems thinking is actually a different way of seeing things. It's a bigger perspective. It's a holistic perspective. So in systems thinking, we see a problem and we apply a fix, but it doesn't stop there. We realize that every time we apply a fix, that's going to impact the problem itself. It's going to impact how we do everything. There's feedback that flows from that fix because we've applied a policy, or we've made a change, or we've hired or fired, or we've done something, and that impacts the entire system. So every time we apply a fix, it doesn't just stop at that one piece. It affects everything else, and that's a mechanism called feedback. There's a great saying that I like to quote that comes from a Jim Harrington book, and that is that every change changes everything in the church. Every change changes everything in the church. Well, how can that be? Well, that's because the church is a system, and systems are not only interconnected, they're interdependent. So although you may not believe that what happens in the kitchen on Sunday morning is connected to what happens on Wednesday evening in the youth ministry room, they're connected. They may be distant connections and you may not see the immediate connection, but everything in a system is connected. That's the key to systems thinking. So if every change changes everything, what we do here affects everything in the system, and we have to pay attention to the feedback to understand what those changes and those impacts are. Systems thinking, in contrast to linear thinking, is characterized this way. We're concerned with the whole, not just the parts. And we're concerned with processes, not just events or happenings. We're concerned with the underlying dynamics of what's happening here. And the underlying dynamics are usually the feedback. It's not just this, but it's this. It's what happens when we apply a new policy. What are the consequences of making a change? Those are the underlying dynamics. We look for patterns in the chaos. Rather than trying to control chaos, which we know we can't do, and yet we try, we look for patterns in that chaos, because in the patterns, we can bring change. And we believe that churches are unpredictable in a chaotic environment. We don't assume that churches are predictable and orderly. They're not. In a chaotic environment, a church is unpredictable. And church is a social system, and in social systems, they tend to operate counterintuitively. And so where we think the common sense action is very often not the best place to act. They're very often not the best things to do. So, systems thinking is a new perspective. It's seeing the whole. It's understanding things in a new way. And quite honestly, if you want to solve a lot of the church's problems that were created with linear thinking, we need to adopt systems thinking as a healthy way to approach those problems. The other thing that I want to leave you with in this part is that because everything is connected and all of those parts are interdependent, the structure of the system, in other words, the structure of your church, drives the outcomes of your church. And let me ask you a question. Have you ever been in a situation where you're not accomplishing what you thought you were going to accomplish? The vision and the mission that you have communicated to the congregation are not being accomplished? And as a matter of fact, it may be that you're encountering problems that have been in the church for 10 or 15 or 20 years, and they just keep coming back and coming back. That is not a problem of personnel. It's not a problem that you need another program for. The problem is that the outcomes are being driven by the structure of your church system. And the only way to deal with those problems is to look at that structure and deal with it effectively. That's what we're going to talk about over the next 4 weeks. And I'm going to invite you to participate. And we have handouts available on the website for you that will help you and give you more information throughout this series. So I'll see you next time to keep talking about systems thinking.